All right, we're recording. Thank you to all of our attendees who are already in the room. I know some others might be joining us as 7 o'clock comes and goes. I'm going to start off by thanking the Department of Political Science for putting this together. We usually hold these in our big auditoriums, but have not been able to do that for now a year and a half or so. But we're thrilled that we are able to still present events like this to our students. Also thrilled that so many of you guys have submitted questions for the panel. Most of the things that I'm going to ask today as the moderator are things that either you asked directly or were inspired by me piecing together different questions that you guys asked. And so with that, let's introduce our panel. On my top left, although it might not be your top left, is David Kerr. And David has an extensive background working on Capitol Hill, has a passionate interest in Congress and congressional operations with a particular focus on the relationship between the executive and legislative branches. And he has also been active in Virginia politics for several decades. David Kerr has served in local office and has written extensively in a weekly column about Virginia politics, its history, and its evolution. And this helps inform his instruction when it comes to the politics of state and local government. Here at VCU, if you like what you hear from Professor Kerr tonight, he does teach state and local government. He also sometimes teaches our intro to American government class. Bill Bolling is a former lieutenant governor of Virginia, and he also teaches here at VCU on occasion. In the fall, nope, we're in the fall now. In the spring, he will be teaching a course on, what did we decide on, Bill? Is it parties and elections or campaigns?
Parties and elections, that's right, campaigns,
Great.
parties and elections.
Parties and elections. So Bill Bolling's an American businessman, politician, and educator who served as the 39th Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. Running as a Republican, he was elected twice to the position by defeating his Democratic opponent in both the 2005 and 2009 general elections. And then we have two of our full-time faculty with us. Dr. Amanda Winterseek comes to us teaching things like public opinion, the media, research methods, political behavior, and the Intro to American Government course. And Dr. Alex Kina is also American politics professor, also research methods, but also Congress, the presidency. And in spring, we'll be offering a special topics course that looks at money in politics, gerrymandering and election law, I believe. So with that, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to jump right into our questions. So this first one will be for everyone, and we'll kind of go in the order that I just introduced you. Give us a very brief overview here, because I know that you and your co-panelists will expand on these answers more as we get going. But what one or two things about the 2021 Virginia elections, whether the gubernatorial elections or some of the other races, are you most interested in, or do you think the public should be paying more attention to? So David, go ahead.
Well, you know, I have always have had an interest in the history of political science, and in this case, like you said, I went back decades, which is kind of scary. That's almost as far back as Bill Bolling goes.
Almost, but not
in
quite.
Virginia politics, and it's just how similar this campaign is in a way to other campaigns that have preceded it. Ones where odds-on favorites, going to win, no problem, going to beat the Republican. In actually every case, it was a Democrat who ended up losing, and then was bested by the underdog. And it always surprises me when I look at that. It's my word of the day. It's called pivot. The inability of these complacent campaigns to pivot and challenge their opponent, who is also usually an underdog, and then go ahead and fail to pivot and lose. And I think that's possibly what's happening this year. You kind of you go back, let's say, to May, the GOP surprisingly very successful nominating convention, and McAuliffe looked like he could beat anybody who was on the list. And Glenn Youngkin, not much of a platform when you get right down to it, unknown to the average voter, being tied in with Donald Trump, didn't look like he had a prayer. But you know, the thing is, it seems like that's all been turned on its head. And I think it has a lot to do with McAuliffe's inability to pivot, to change. He's not following an example of his mentor. His mentor was Bill Clinton. Now, Bill Clinton ran in 6 gubernatorial campaigns, because in Arkansas, you ran every 2 years. And for governor, how would you like to do that? And nightmarish. His party's primary, two presidential campaigns. And then there's nobody who could take a situation that was a complete and total disaster, of which he had many scandals, issues, challenges, and turn it on its head within 24 hours. He could rewrite the narrative, come up with a whole new series of social, well, they didn't have social media those days, TV ads, people talking for him all over the country. I mean, it was an amazingly organized machine. And having said that, McAuliffe is a product of that machine. So it leaves me kind of stymied to watch him flounder in this campaign in the face of somebody who is an unknown, who really shouldn't be as, frankly, as successful as he has been. I think a lot of it has to do with McAuliffe's complacency. And it's a term that I'll mention a couple other examples of campaigns. I'm going to keep this short. But he's began by running ads about what he did in the teens. Well, 2013 to 2017. And that's all very well and good. It's great to have created jobs in 2015. But this is a new world. It's a world of COVID. We're economically dislocated, we're vaccine divided. There's a learning gap, serious learning gap, frankly, when it comes to kids and where they stand in school. And I've called them the anxious 20s. And he is still talking about what he did in the teens. And he doesn't seem to have, in my view, Youngkin doesn't seem to have all that robust a platform. He does have one thing about him that is rather impressive, and that is he starts almost every speech with "from day one." And it's a very compelling, futuristic, future-looking statement. Doesn't always say exactly what he's going to do from day one. He's trying to keep the base of the GOP happy, the Trump base happy. He's trying to keep, at the same token, doing the activist approach, not running on your laurels from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, is very appealing. I think he's digging into a vote that Democrats are having a tough time hanging on to. And the challenge is McAuliffe isn't pivoting. He wants this to be a repeat of election 2020. He's just kind of assuming that it's just going to be the same deal. I have a friend who's a reporter, which means he gets to go around and listen to these guys all the time giving the same speech. Bill, I'm sure they heard your speeches several times too. But McAuliffe, they actually take bets. They took bets at one debate on how many times McAuliffe would tie Youngkin to Trump. And 15 was where the pool was, and they managed to, and that didn't work. It was 20. You can do that for a while, and you'll get people upset. And then after a while, after you've seen the 350th ad on your social media, it just kind of dulls over. It just, one guy saying, "Oh, I like Donald Trump." It sets some of my friends on fire, but at the same token, I think it just kind of dulls people over. Now, I go back to 2 campaigns where we had these odds-on favorites, and then I'll close out. And I think McAuliffe is falling into that trap. Here he is, a completely unknown guy running against him. McAuliffe is outraising Youngkin, who's a many multi-millionaire. Could be richer than Mark Warner. He's within, in many polls, he's within the margin of error for winning or losing. And that's really astounding, since he just isn't that known a quantity. Bill will certainly remember Mary Sue Terry. I hope you do. I hope I'm not that much older than you. She was a twice elected attorney general. She was actually a pretty competent attorney general. But it was George Allen, at that time, a former member of the House of Delegates, a one-year congressman, got redistricted out of his seat, and he went and ran for governor. And he attacked her on her record on crime. It was the 1990s. Crime was the issue. And while she could have defended herself pretty well, she had been pretty rigorous on mandatory sentencing, for example. She didn't. And she had plenty of money. She did not pivot. And as I said, pivot is my word of the day. When attacked, you change course and you meet the enemy. I was in the Navy. So, if the best attack is straight on. And well, what happened? She lost by a landslide, one of the biggest landslides up to that point from a candidate who was leading George Allen by about 10 points before the June primary. And I go to one more example, and then I'll shut up with ancient historical examples from Virginia history. I won't go back to the Jefferson campaign. But Don Beyer, he's the 8th District Congressman now, former ambassador to Sweden, generally ended up okay in the political career business. But way back when, he was a twice elected lieutenant governor, talented guy, nice guy. If you lived in Northern Virginia, you heard his funny, cute, very endearing ads for his Volvo dealership. It was hard I'm not a fan of Volvos, but well, actually we owned one. So I guess I must have been some kind of fan. And I just liked listening to them. So that was the kind of image he had, sweet guy. And Jim Gilmore, former governor, kind of known for being a little bit cantankerous, that may be the understatement of the year, but he got the notion of no car tax. It was a brilliant idea. People hate paying the car tax. You go out and buy yourself a nice fancy car, and then somebody sends you a bill for $2,000 from the county. Byers was caught completely flat-footed. He did not know how to respond. There were ways to respond. There were ways to change the narrative. But he just kind of sat there and took it, and his poll numbers were grim. He lost by a landslide. And I look back to 2013. And there was an old joke. I hope I say this right. That was a former Speaker of the House told me this. I hadn't heard it before, but the Democrats nominated the only candidate that could lose to Cuccinelli, and the Republicans nominated the only candidate that could lose to McAuliffe. And so there was I hope I got that right. Anyway, the point was they both nominated subpar candidates, and still McAuliffe could raise money. He had tons of money. He had these tremendous Clinton connections. He had all that advantage, and Cuccinelli, as in my personal opinion, as absent of a moral compass as a politician can be. I'm sorry, that's probably too harsh an opinion, but he's not in public office anymore. He can give me a call and yell at me if he wants to. Is that he at the last minute, he launched some fairly effective attacks. And I think we're seeing a repeat of McAuliffe's behavior again. The rollout of Obamacare had been a complete and total disaster. The online system had not been beta tested. People were all angry. Congressmen were being called. The press was giving them hell. And the Democratic candidate takes it on the chin. And it was hurting. It cut a few points off the top. And then also at the same time, Cuccinelli decides he's going to price out Terry McAuliffe's rather expensive social programs. Not a bad strategy. Somebody gave him some good advice for a change. McAuliffe didn't respond. There are a number of ways you could have changed the narrative there, but he didn't. And then finally, getting desperate and realizing he's going to lose, Cuccinelli just said, I want to cut taxes. I don't care what, all taxes. It was, again, no response. And what was generally a wider margin, if you go back to the polls at the time, they're pretty wide, actually. Came down to about 2% or something in that range in the actual win. It was one of the closest gubernatorial elections in recent history. I think probably the last one that would have been closer would have been Warner versus Coleman way back in '89. And,
David, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to stop right now. If you want to finish your sentence, that's fine, but we're at over 10 minutes. So.
My God, I can't believe that. I apologize. Inability to pivot. McAuliffe doesn't seem to have it.
Great. Bill, do you want to take a stab at one or two things you think the public should be paying more attention to than they are, or that you find particularly interesting?
Yeah, well, I think David certainly hit on an important one, which is the unpredictability of where this race stands right now. I mean, let's keep in mind that Democrats have won the last 13 statewide political campaigns in Virginia. I think everyone really assumed this was McAuliffe's race to lose. I think we're now seeing he may be fully capable of doing just that. It's become a much closer race than anybody thought it would be. The Real Clear Politics aggregation of the polls shows McAuliffe with 1.2% lead right now, which is well within a 3-point margin of error. And the last two polls, one of which came out today from Monmouth, actually shows the race tied. So this has turned into a very close race. I don't think anyone really expected that, given the trajectory of campaigns in Virginia over the course of the past decade. So I think we really have to ask ourselves why, what happened? And I would suggest just real quick, three things. Number one, Republicans nominated a really good candidate in Glenn Youngkin. He's a very well-known, successful business leader. He doesn't have a lot of political baggage because he's never run for political office before. And he has $500 million, and he's invested $20 million of his own money in this campaign so far. So Youngkin has turned out to be a much stronger candidate than I think a lot of people thought he would be. Secondly, I think McAuliffe has made a couple gaffes in the campaign that have created some openings for Youngkin. Remember, about a month ago, McAuliffe was up by about 5 points in these polls. And then there was an interesting debate a couple of weeks ago up in Northern Virginia, where former Governor McAuliffe was asked a question about some parents had taken exception to some books that were in a public school library in Northern Virginia. And McAuliffe was asked about that. And his answer to that question was, well, I don't think we can have parents coming into a library taking out books. And he was fine with that answer. But then he went on to say words that we've all heard, 1,000 times since then. I don't think we should have parents telling schools what to teach. Now, I know exactly what he meant. The fact is that parents have never told schools what to teach. Curriculum is adopted by the State Board of Education. So I know exactly what he meant to say, but the words that came out of his mouth, Youngkin has used against him very effectively over the course of the past couple of weeks. He's made this campaign about education. He's made it about parents' ability to control and direct the education of their children. And since that gaffe at that debate, these polls have steadily closed from 5 points to 4 points to 3 points to 2 points. So I think one of the things we may see from this election is that debates can matter. Things can happen in debates that change the trajectory of a campaign. And then lastly, I think another big factor to watch here is I think this election shows us how external events can change the direction of a campaign. If we were sitting here 2 weeks from the election and President Biden's approval rating was 55%, we wouldn't be having this kind of a conversation. But when President Biden's approval rating falls well into the 40s and now into the low 40s, that can change the trajectory of a campaign. So the truth is, I think Republicans have done some things right. Democrats have served up some soft lobs at center court. These external circumstances are working in the Republicans' favor. Now, whether or not that will be enough to produce a Republican victory on election day very much remains to be seen. But Republicans are in this race 2 weeks prior to the election, which is a place they have not been in a very, very long time.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Winterseek, do you want to go next?
Sure. So thank you, Allie, for taking time to moderate tonight, and thanks to the Department of Political Science for hosting. I think I, like everybody, look forward to getting out of my basement, but until then, it's nice to see some faces. So the thing that I've been most interested in this particular election is not necessarily a new trend, but a trend that is definitely exacerbated by the events of the 2020 election and political polarization and negative partisanship. And that is the role that the nationalization of politics has played in this race. And so Bill points to the decline in President Biden's approval, but I think that it's a lot more than that we're seeing in this race. In particular, we see the Democrats following the national playbook in their nomination of McAuliffe, that is to choose an old white, middle of the road Democrat who turns out to not broadly appeal to the Democratic base in Virginia. And we're seeing that in low turnout numbers among young people. And we're also seeing that the Democrats' inability at the federal level to get anything done as it relates to infrastructure or any of their major agenda items are trickling down and making voters really question whether or not the Democratic Party across the country, right, has the capacity to implement and sustain a policy agenda. And so in many ways, this is becoming a referendum on the Democrats' ability to govern nationally. Like I said, this is not new, right? This has been the case for the last 2-ish decades that we've seen an increase in the nationalization of politics. But every single year that gets stronger, and our particular political moment with high levels of polarization and high levels of negative partisanship are definitely influencing this.
Awesome. And Dr. Kina, your shot.
I have to say first that I 100% agree with Dr. Winterseek. And it's funny because I wanted to talk a little bit about the effects, the elephant in the room, which is the effects of an odd year election on turnout and how this pretty much structures all of the results. And it's ironic that the election in Virginia is nationalized. It very much is. You could argue that the Democratic Party has become more nationalized right now than the Republican Party, but only because of the effects of Trump and his impact on the National Party. But it's ironic because the whole reason we have an odd year gubernatorial election was to insulate our state from the effects of national party politics. So in my view, what's going on with odd year election cycles? There's only 4 other states that hold their governor elections during an odd year, either the year before or the year after a presidential election. And the idea is you want to make sure that you're not tainting the effects of our state level races with the coattails of a presidential ticket or some other national level election. But the truth is we haven't really talked a lot about issues that are unique to Virginia. A lot of the talking points have been driven by these national level talking points. But what I'm looking forward to the results to see is the effect of mail-in voting on odd year election cycle. So one of the consequences of our odd year calendar that we have in Virginia is that only a fraction of the electorate actually bothers to show up and vote. And who are the people who are actually voting in an odd year turnout? It's the high knowledge voters, people who tend to be wealthier, older, more white than the rest of the population. And I want to see if the Democrats' ability to get mail-in voting expanded actually impacts turnout rates in the election. Because it's important to note that, yes, you know, when you think about the idea that a candidate should pivot to the center, that may be true, but the number of voters is not a fixed number of voters. Candidates impact how many of their supporters actually show up to the polls. And if you're a Democrat, it's a lot easier to convince people to mail in a ballot months before election day than it is to convince them to show up on this one day during this 13-hour window. I also want to see if this is a strategy that's working for the Republicans, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the elections, casting doubt on electoral integrity, because perhaps the Republicans might actually be hurt by the fact that most of their voters are going to be showing up on election day. And that requires a coordination of their collective action. And so I want to see, what do the Republicans take from this? Will this Republican strategy of doubling down on turnout on election day actually help their efforts? Because in many ways, I do agree with some of the comments that we've heard that about the strength of Youngkin as a candidate. Clearly, he's appealed to the Virginia electorate more broadly than a lot of other Republicans. And McAuliffe is, you know, I can't disagree that he's a pretty generic candidate who hasn't really inspired a lot of enthusiasm. So will this enthusiasm gap that we see translate to actual votes on election day?
Great, thank you. I'm gonna put this first question in Dr. Winterseek's purview here. And I should say all of your responses have touched nicely on things we're going to talk about. So if you're watching and hoping that something would have been expanded upon, we're going to. So in a dead heat, which polls carry the most weight or are likely to get the predictions most correct, if any of them are the answer? This question and many others come straight from our attendees. Are the state level polls being conducted for the Virginia governor's race more or less reliable than polls we see during presidential elections? And do you think there's any lessons about polling that we can take away from other recent elections, like the 2021 California recall election that predicted a much closer race than actually occurred?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start at the top about good versus bad polls. Some of you may have seen reference to some of the internal polling that's coming out from the Republican Party and the Republican Governors Association in particular. This polling seems to suggest that the Republicans are leading in both the gubernatorial, the lieutenant governors, and the attorney general race. And this has then been touted in sort of the national media as this narrative of like flipping the script and that the Republicans have done what they needed to do in Virginia. I'd be really cautious of internal polls. Internal polls tend to have a lot of methodological problems, but more specifically, these internal polls tend to be like taking a bag of golf balls, multicolored golf balls. You know, when you go like to the beach and you go mini putting, you pick your ball, and it's like pulling out a pink ball out of that bag of golf balls and saying, look, every single ball in this bag is pink, right? Indicating that every single poll would indicate that Republicans are ahead. And so that's simply not the case. Internal polls tend to be bad polls, polls you shouldn't really rely on. One need only ask Mitt Romney how that worked out for him in 2012 and his prediction that he would win the presidential election based on his internal polling. I think it's particularly problematic that we're seeing these internal polls from the Republican Party being touted in the national media when we have really high quality public polls. Polls like the Monmouth and the Trafalgar Group are both A+ rated or A+ and A- rated polling organizations, according to Nate Silver. And so paying attention to those public polls is going to be the much better way to go generally. That being said, if we think about the quality of these polls, we should be cautious of any one and done survey, right? These are cross sections that may have bias in them. For example, they may have oversampled Republicans, or they may have oversampled women, or they may have oversampled Democrats, right? And so we should be looking at polling averages more generally in terms of trying to get a more accurate read on the state of the race. And one thing I would note about the polls, if we go all the way back to, I think, like August 28th or August 29th, the polls have remained fairly steady. The averages in the polls have remained fairly steady, with McAuliffe having about a +2 lead, right? And so if we're talking about the state of the race in terms of the polling hasn't really changed since the end of August, right? We've not seen any dramatic change in that margin. That being said, state level polls like this have high margins of error. If you're looking at margins of error, you're going to see them reporting somewhere in the realm of 3 to 4%. The reality is, because we don't have true probability samples, we can get as close as we can with trying to get good representative samples, although that's not always achievable, that the true margin of error in these surveys is likely closer to 8, maybe 10%, right? And so these are really imprecise measures, and they need to be understood as imprecise measures. And in that regard, they're not terribly effective if we're trying to use them to predict the outcome of an election. The directionality of an election, certainly, but the outcome of an election, most certainly not. So be cautious of looking at the surveys and making definitive or declarative statements about who's ahead and who's behind and why. Finally, I would note that one thing we do know, good, bad, or indifferent, is that the prediction markets are a much better benchmark in terms of accuracy, that is accurately calling races. And so there are a number of just purely political science purposes, doing research on whether or not you can more or less gamble on the outcome of elections and have better inputs than you do with polls. And Predict It, which is run out of the University of Iowa, has a deep history going back to the 80s. Has a really good track record of calling elections correctly. And so if you look at the Predict It data, I was just looking at that earlier today, while the prediction for who wins the gubernatorial race has changed slightly. That is, the amount of money it costs to bet for a Democrat has decreased by about 3 cents. The Democratic stock, effectively, or the ticket you're buying, is still at 69 cents to the Republican ticket at 32 cents, right? And so in that regards, there's fairly strong attitudes about the Democrat winning this, at least the gubernatorial election. Why are prediction markets theoretically better than polls? Because they can account for all known and unknown factors, right? In polls, we can only ask so many questions and we can only plug those questions into so many regression models. But theoretically, when markets prevail, they're accounting for all information simultaneously. So well, I do want to caution that I don't necessarily think gambling on elections is a good way to go, but if we're trying to predict outcomes, prediction markets have been a much better indicator.
Great. David, I'm actually going to skip your question right now because you answered it all moments ago. And I don't know that there's anything, I reread through it. I don't know that you left anything to talk about there. So if there's anything that comes to your head, we can tack that on later on. But
No need.
I'm
It was a beautiful answer, by the way. That was a very interesting and thoughtful response. I really enjoyed it.
I'm going to skip to Dr. Kina real quick and ask him a question about money. This will be maybe a little bit of a preview for your spring class. The classic film, All the President's Men, implored the protagonist to follow the money. If we were to follow the money in the gubernatorial election, what kinds of things would we learn about the candidates, the parties, and the interest groups or donors that are pumping money into the race? What does the amount of money raised by each candidate tell us about how competitive the race is, or how much attention the rest of the country is paying to the race?
That's an excellent question. And I think it actually kind of dovetails nicely with Dr. Winterseek's question. Money is an imperfect measure of the race predictability. So Hillary Clinton outraised Donald Trump in 2016 like 3-1. Obviously, people who don't raise as much money end up winning sometimes. But when you delve into the detail, you can get a lot of interesting nuances about the dynamics of the race. So first, McAuliffe and Youngkin are pretty much tied in terms of the amount of money they've raised. I just checked the latest filings and it looks like McAuliffe has about $44 million he's raised. Youngkin has $42 million, although Youngkin gave his own campaign a loan of $16.5 million. So once you subtract that out, it's a substantial advantage that McAuliffe has. Now, the practical effect of that is a wash because they're both sort of being able to spend and maintain the same amount of funds as each other. But what it does mean is that there are very different dynamics in terms of the donor bases. So both candidates are drawing a lot of money from lawyers and professional people who have ties to professional politics. And that, you know, it's about half of the money, more than half that's where McAuliffe gets his money from. And likewise with Youngkin, the vast majority comes from those sectors. However, what's really, really interesting to me is that McAuliffe is outraising Youngkin, the Republican, more than 3-1 when it comes to donors whose occupation is in the financial services sector. This is like flipping the script because it used to be that Republicans were the ones who would clean up with financial services and Democrats were the ones who would raise a lot less money. But McAuliffe is the type of candidate who it appears that Wall Street, it appears that financial services, the financial industry has put their money behind McAuliffe. And in some ways, McAuliffe comes to the race with like an incumbent advantage because typically you see incumbents outraise challengers by orders of magnitude when it comes to these types of sectors. So I think that like what Dr. Winterseek was saying, McAuliffe is the betting markets are sort of pointing to McAuliffe here, and even industries that have traditionally donated Republicans are putting their money towards McAuliffe. The other interesting thing is when you look at the geography of the money that's flowing into this campaign. So what we've seen over the last like 3 decades in American politics is there's like 4 or 5 or 6 cities that account for a growing share of all the money that's spent in politics. And this is the case in Virginia. Youngkin is raising 3/4 of his money from within the state of Virginia, within the Commonwealth of Virginia, although that includes his own $16 million. So it's harder to tease that out. And 16% of the money that he's raised comes from Washington, D.C., presumably lobbyists, financial services. He's also raised significant sums from Texas, California, and Florida. Okay, so 1/4 of Youngkin's money is coming from out of state. For McAuliffe, 2/3 of his money is coming from out of state. McAuliffe is pulling 1/4 of his $44 million from Washington, D.C., and several million from Florida, California, New York, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. So what we're seeing, if you are a Democrat, is somewhat troubling. The truth is that much of the energy behind McAuliffe's campaign is coming from out of the Commonwealth. And if you just strip out all of the loans to their own campaigns and all the money that's coming from out of state, candidates are about even when it comes to raising money from in-state. But for both candidates, more than 90% of their money comes from donations over $100. And so we don't really see a lot of grassroots energy in either of these campaigns. When you see a grassroots campaign, that's reflected in the fundraising strategy that the candidates have, and neither candidates have anything that looks remarkably close to a grassroots campaign. So to me, this is really interesting. I'll be interested in seeing the final figures and how they look and how that maps up to the results that we end up seeing.
Great, thank you. I also see some questions starting to come in, and I'm going to keep tab of those as they do and try to wedge them into the conversation when they kind of fit some of the other questions we've got going on. So keep those coming and I will look through those. This next question is going to be for Professor Bowling. During the 2016 and 2020 elections, we heard a lot about the enthusiasm gap, where Trump supporters were very energetic and excited, but Democratic voters were more subdued, albeit steady in their support for Clinton and Biden. Do you think there's an enthusiasm gap in the Virginia gubernatorial race, especially after 13 straight statewide electoral victories? And if so, do you think that's going to end up mattering?
That's a great question. And ultimately, Allie, I think that's probably what this election comes down to. You know, Amanda earlier was talking about the polls and looking at the polls and what are good polls and what are bad polls and which polls can you trust and which can't you trust. And the truth is there's only one poll that matters, and that's the one that's taken on election day. And that poll is going to be determined by who shows up to vote. And that goes to the heart of your question. It's really all about enthusiasm. You know, are Republicans more motivated? Are Democrats more motivated? And if Republicans are more motivated, which I personally think at this point in the election they are, is that motivation alone enough to overcome the fact that Democrats have won these last 13 statewide campaigns by a margin of 7 points on average? That's a pretty impressive margin and a pretty significant delta that a Republican has to cover. So here's what I think we know. I think Republicans are motivated and energized in this election. They're for a lot of reasons. First of all, they're tired of losing. They've lost the last 13 of these races. Second, they're very concerned about the direction that the current Democratic majorities in Richmond have taken the state in. And third, they're fairly unified behind their candidate for the first time in a long time, which is a remarkable accomplishment. The Republican Party has so many different wings and factions. The fact that Glenn Youngkin has been able to hold them relatively together over the course of this campaign is pretty remarkable in and of itself. So, I have no doubt that Republicans are enthused and Republicans will vote, Republicans will turn out in this election. I think the question is, what's that level of enthusiasm on the Democratic side? And it's hard to measure that. Anecdotally, what I hear from people across the state is that enthusiasm seems to be greater on the Republican side. The polling data that I have seen on that question shows a little more enthusiasm on the Republican side. But look, I think personally, what this race comes down to, if you're Terry McAuliffe, is his ability to enthuse and turn out the base vote of the Democratic Party, and that's the Black vote. And if he can turn out the Black vote in places like Richmond and Henrico and Norfolk and Portsmouth and Newport News and Hampton, he will win this election. If the base vote of the Democratic Party shows up, Terry McAuliffe will win this election because there's simply more Democrats than Republicans in Virginia these days. So that's the question. Will that base vote turn out for Terry McAuliffe? Amanda touched on this. Will they be excited about a candidate who is older and who is white and who is fairly establishment? And I can say that because I'm older and I'm white and I'm fairly establishment. Will they turn out to vote? Will Democrats be excited enough to go vote for that candidate? I have my doubts about that. We'll see. Democrats, the base certainly turned out in 2020 to vote for Joe Biden. They did not turn out in 2016 to vote for Hillary Clinton. So will they turn out in 2021 to vote for Terry McAuliffe? That's why I think you see in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, the McAuliffe campaign doing something that was predictable and smart. You know, they're bringing in surrogates from across the country, like Stacey Abrams, like President Obama, who will be here in Richmond this weekend. They're really trying to rev up, excite, and enthuse that base vote. So I think this probably becomes a base mobilization election. Which party does the better job getting their base to turn out? Republicans will turn out. From everything I've seen, I'm confident in this election, Republicans will turn out. The real question is, will Democrats turn out? If they do, Terry McAuliffe will be the next governor of Virginia. If they don't, then they create an opportunity for Republicans that Republicans might not have otherwise had.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, reactionary politics, it's easier to get enthusiastic when you're trying to oust somebody, right? America likes to boo people as much as it likes to cheer sometimes.
Absolutely.
Despite the lack of enthusiasm for Biden, he was the challenger in 2020. So that might make a difference. But at the same time, as you said, an unenthusiastic vote counts the same amount as an enthusiastic vote. You don't get twice as much power in the voting booth just because you really like a person. And so mobilizing will be key. Also, real quick, just 2016 is such a weird year to have to refer to too, because in a lot of ways, like Clinton did mobilize her base. It was other groups that she didn't mobilize and lost. And because of, how a couple thousand votes went in certain places, the Electoral College tipped in a different direction despite winning the popular vote. So 2016 is always kind of tough to know really what lessons to take from there too. But thank you for that. And I see Dr. Wintersee has a hand up, so go ahead and touch on whatever you want.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a bit to this because, and Ali, you bring up negativity bias, right? When you're motivated to oust somebody, a negative implication or a negative affect is more powerful than a positive affect. So you're more likely to act on those negative affects. So if you're really unhappy about what's going on in your state, Republicans have a Democratic governor, they're going to turn out to vote. But if you're really happy, right, that reduces your motivations to some extent. But the other thing I think we need to consider is sort of the historical aspects of like who votes and who doesn't in these cases. And Republicans on the whole are much more likely to turn out to vote than are Democrats to begin with, for a variety of reasons. And so the Democrats have to work double time in elections like this in order to get people to show up to vote, right? So we have to acknowledge that these things aren't necessarily unique to this time period we're in. These are things that we know about voters generally and who shows up.
Great. And Dr. Wintersee, we're going to stick with you for this next question. In many elections across the country, Trump's looming presence and his big lies about the election fraud in 2020 are taking their toll on Republican efforts to mobilize their base, or at least that is the narrative that we hear in the media. How much impact, if any, is Trump having on Virginia's elections, whether at the state or local levels? And do you think that could be a problem for Youngkin and down ballot candidates on election day? Or is there something about the way Youngkin is running his campaign or the voters in Virginia that might fly in the face of what we're seeing elsewhere?
So this is a really complex question that I've been trying to wrap my head around this entire election, because of course, Youngkin enters the race as a pro-Trump candidate with the endorsement of Donald Trump and being very vocal about how a vote for him is a vote for Donald Trump. He backs away from that a little bit in the latter half of the summer. But it seems that he's embracing some of that again. I was driving down Arthur Ashe the other day, and there are these big red signs that say Youngkin equals Trump. And I don't know if those are pro-Youngkin signs or anti-Youngkin signs, right? And I think that this is sort of illustrative of the problem more generally, that it's in the vested interest of both of the political parties to some extent to have Trump be a focal point of this race. Trump is still the dominant character in Republican politics. He has inspired a great deal of loyalty nationally. He brings crowds, he brings money, and to some extent, Republicans want to ride that wave. At the same time, Democrats want to make sure that Donald Trump is central to this, right? Because when you have a president who is a Democrat with low presidential approval numbers, the thing that you're trying to remind your voters of is not what's going on now, but what was going on 2 years ago, right? And to remind them about Donald Trump and that that was terrible for you as a Democrat at that time, right? In a hope to get your vote out. So in some ways, I think he's been very central, although we've seen that ebb and flow, particularly as Youngkin has tried to back off and then put the gas back on, being part of the Trump train. In terms of the big lie and how this is affecting turnout, it is quite clearly affecting early voter turnout, right? We have about 500,000 people who have voted early in the election so far, give or take. And we are pretty certain that most of those are Democrats, right? And you only need to go to the polling to look at this, that when asked about whether or not you intend to vote early, Republicans are by and large saying no. They are continuing to bring up that big lie that it's not a safe and secure system, that there's fraud in that system, that there is doubt about the results of any election where there is large scale early voting going on or mail voting going on. So that definitely has continued to be a looming presence in this election. And I don't foresee that going away. Even if we have, which we will, a safe and secure election with little to no voter fraud, right? Because voter fraud is rare, doesn't happen very frequently at all. And even if it doesn't change election outcomes, right? So I would be interested to see what others have to say about this, because I think that Donald Trump's involvement in this race is a little bit more difficult to put your thumb on.
Yeah, and Professor Bowling, I was hoping you would weigh in on this one too, especially because, I mean, I don't actually get a lot of, advertising because I'm not watching cable, which is where they tend to put the ads, and I don't listen to the radio, which is the other place they tend to put the ads. So I don't hear a lot of it, but I haven't actually heard Youngkin talking much about the big lie. Has Republicans in the state been actually pushing for their voters to go out and go ahead and vote early in hopes of pushing back against some of that Trump narrative, or have they been kind of just quiet altogether? What is their strategy been trying to thread that needle?
Well, far be it from me to speak for all Republicans. I served as one for 22 years. I'm kind of more of a Republicrat these days than a Republican, but I still get all of the literature and I still get all the stuff. So I think I can say this. I think one of the lessons that Republicans should have learned from 2020 is that they are far better off embracing alternate voting technologies than they are trying to resist them. And, in 2020, President Trump really encouraged Republicans, don't vote early, don't vote absentee, don't vote by mail, show up at the polls on election day. And frankly, I think that was a mistake. If Republicans had embraced these new alternative voting methods, they may well have turned out a few more people in 2020 than they did, which could have made a difference in some key states. So, I think in this election, you'll see many more Republican votes cast through Virginia's no excuse absentee voting practice. I myself have already voted through the absentee voting practice. I think you'll see many more Republicans voting early. So I think in 2020, those numbers that showed Democrats voting much heavier in early voting than Republicans, I think those numbers will be a lot closer together in 2021 and probably in future election years as well. I think this expanded use of alternative voting is a good thing. And I think that Republicans have learned that they need to embrace it as best they can and not resist it. The one point that Amanda made that I wanted to touch on, she made a great point about these signs that she sees in the city of Richmond that says Youngkin equals Trump. One of the things that is for sure is that Terry McAuliffe has tried very much in this campaign to make it about Donald Trump. And with good reason. Trump never got more than 44% of the vote in Virginia. He was very unpopular in Virginia. If Terry McAuliffe could make voters think that Glenn Youngkin is Donald Trump reincarnated, that's a plus, for him. But there are some parts of the state where that actually is an asset. It's an advantage to Glenn Youngkin, and that's the delicate balance that he's tried to walk so far successfully in this campaign of being enough like Trump to appeal to voters in, say, the western part of the state, but enough different from Trump to maybe appeal to more suburban type of voters. So I was thinking that sign that Amanda referred to, if you took that Youngkin equals Trump sign and you put it in downtown Richmond, my guess is it's put there by McAuliffe folks who want to turn off Youngkin voters. If you took that same sign and you put it out in Western Virginia, it may have been put there by Youngkin trying to encourage Trump voters to come to the polls and vote for him. So the ironic and somewhat maybe depressing thing about this election is it still does show this looming presence that Donald Trump has within the Republican Party. In order to get the support of the base of the party, you certainly can't be anti-Trump. But within the general electorate, particularly in a state like Virginia, that's not a positive thing. So it's a very delicate balance that Youngkin has had to walk. And remarkably, I think he's done it fairly successfully thus far.
Right. And, it's also interesting thinking about Trump in just that Trump is not that far away when he was governing from the Republican platform anyway. Certainly he had some differences, but a lot of the things that people have had to distance themselves from that more moderate Republican voters didn't like was more the behavioral stuff. So candidates, when they're running, they don't necessarily have to prove they're not like Trump on policy, because a lot of that is very standard bearing Republican stuff. And so it just becomes more about letting your surrogates kind of argue to people that, in this part, oh, trust me, wink, wink, he likes Trump. And then over here, different surrogates, wink, winking, he doesn't. And Youngkin can kind of just stand there, be his more vanilla moderate self, and let other people try to convince people that they are trusted by, that they will represent them too. So he's at an interesting spot, I think, anyway. Professor Kerr, this next one is for you.
Yes, ma'am.
We've touched on this a little bit in our intros, but much has been made of Biden's sagging approval rating. 538.com notes that for the first time in his presidency, Biden's disapproval just barely topped the 50% mark. Still, his approval rating is still higher than Trump's at any point during his 4-year term. And it's on par with some past presidents who had very bumpy rides like Clinton, Ford, and until the 2001 terrorist attacks, George W. Bush. Similarly, Democrats in Congress have been portrayed as being in disarray and largely unable to accomplish much of their own agenda, whether that's due to Republican obstruction or due to their inability to get their own few conservative Democrats on board. How does national politics and what's going on in DC affect the state and local elections that we're about to have here in Virginia?
Well, I think that's a very good question, because you pointed out that just about every president who was in the White House when we had a gubernatorial election was sagging. It's not uncommon for a first-year president. Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, all dropped tremendously in the polls in the first year of their administration. And then, of course, right after that came the Virginia gubernatorial race. I think it's... Yeah, I honestly do believe that the national politics are an impact. It's a chance for people who were not happy with the prior administration or the administration to cast a protest vote, a revenge vote, if you will. And so I think that the Biden administration's popularity has hurt enthusiasm with the Democrats because the progressives aren't getting what they want. And he seems ineffective to them. And at the same token, there's a lot of Virginia has a national security focus. And I think there's still a lot of angst about the Afghanistan withdrawal and how badly that went. And yeah, I think that definitely Biden is a drag. I think the national administration has been a drag on just about every gubernatorial candidate, as Bill pointed out. I was at 10 of the last 11 elections. It's the old rule of thumb. Whoever wins the executive mansion in Richmond tends to be the opposite party of who has the White House. And I could get a footnote in on about the Republican voters. I did a lot of door-to-door for a friend of mine who was an independent, by the way. This was in 2019, just before we all shut down. And it was very important to we came across a lot of Republicans who didn't want to vote Republican that year because of Donald Trump. And we had to go to great lengths to say, no, Tom's not a Republican, he's an independent, he used to be a Republican. Well, strange election. I think a lot of these people, and they were Republicans, want to come home. And that's not unusual. You want to go back to your traditional voting patterns, the way you were brought up, your general view of life. Trump had turned them off badly. If Youngkin is able to make them feel a little more warm and cuddly towards the GOP, their home party, what they voted for the past 50 years, and this is our generally older voters we came across, I think he can, he'll win some of those people back. And that I think is going to be a factor in the election.
Great, thank you. Dr. Kina, you've recently suggested, not today, but in an article that I just read on our social media page this morning, that much of what's been put on the Virginia public's radar, especially by the Republican Party, this election cycle has been born more of good strategy as a means to an end, rather than good governing, where the end that they're putting forward is the actual goal. You were talking about wedge issues, these culture war type issues. Can you tell us more about why that's what you think is going on?
Well, it's interesting to provide a little bit of context. In the old days, the Republicans used to be called the Party of Ideas, and they used to be primarily focused on their economic agenda and making their case about their vision for the economy. And in some ways, it kind of seems like Youngkin as a choice kind of fit that traditional mold as a successful business person. Youngkin was not on my radar when I was thinking about the Republicans nominating convention. I was thinking about this being a battle between the old guard, Kirk Cox, former Speaker of the House of Delegates, and a younger Republican like Nick Freitas, and also the Trumpy sort of Amanda Chase influence on the entire dynamics of the primary contest. And it turns out Youngkin didn't really fit any of those. And that might have been why he was selected. Yet he doesn't seem to be running on that economic prowess, that record that he has as a successful business person, that extraordinary wealth that he's amassed. And that's confusing to me because it seems like we have a legitimate discussion about the role of the government in managing the economy. This is a layup for the Republicans to take. They've done this in past years, but it fits increasingly with this trend of Republicans instead focusing on the red meat, the cultural wedge issues. Lieutenant Governor Bowling mentioned the banning books in the libraries of Northern Virginia schools. There have been a lot of sort of angry crowds at school board meetings, and this idea about what books we're subjecting our children to, education. All of this to me is, if you were to ask probably a lot of people of color, these are dog whistle politics from a previous generation. What are we doing? Who are we appealing to? If you were a Republican candidate and you're talking about banning books that talk about race, who exactly are you appealing to? Who are you trying to appeal to here? Because that may have worked in the 1960s under the Byrd machine, but in the year 2021, there's a member of the audience who asked a question about why don't the Republicans kind of pivot towards the middle? And that's a very good question, because there are a lot of conservative Black voters out there who might be put off by that kind of rhetoric. Maybe to white America, talking about banning books that talk about race doesn't really sort of register as sort of like tacitly race, sort of like an appeal to race. But for Black Americans, I think the memory is still very fresh about that. So I think that will this actually help Republicans to talk about these issues that really work with their base? It really angers their base and motivates their base. Particularly look at the exurbs in Northern Virginia, Loudoun County, Fauquier County, where you have a lot of immigration, a lot of change. You have a lot of population growth in the last 10 years. Will that actually translate to more votes on election day? Because it's true, Democrats have more not registered, but Democrats have more supporters in Virginia than Republicans do. And the only way Republicans win is by that enthusiasm gap. Does that work? Is this going to be enough for Republicans? It seems to me that the greatest asset that Youngkin has is sort of being left on the sidelines, that's not being utilized in a way that might actually help him appeal to a broader base. And so to me, this signals a lot of the problems with not only the state Republican Party, but the Republican Party nationally, which is, what is the vision of the future that we're looking at? Because so far, what I've seen are a lot of pages out of a very old playbook that are being dusted off for this particular race.
And Professor Bowling, I'm actually going to skip around questions a bit, because what Alex just said kind of leads into one of the later questions. And it also touches on a question that Jonah in our audience had about who gets run as nominees in the state of Virginia, why, and part of that has to do with the change of the electorate over the last 20 some years. So first I'll read Jonah's question, but then I'm also going to read mine. And to make it a trifecta, I'm actually going to show my screen for a second to show a map of 1996 versus 2020 Virginia, because I think that'll help the attendees visualize what it is you want to talk about. Jonah had asked why, in your opinion, Virginia Republican Party won't run more progressive candidates in the state when Virginia is so consistently blue. And the question that I had was to just ask you to explain a little bit about the shift in the electorate over the recent past. So you had recently given a presentation at George Mason in which you talked about how Virginia has gone from being Democratic to Republican, back to being Democratic since the 90s. And if this works, this is the 1996 map of the Senate race. And this is the 2020 Senate race map. And there's 2 points particularly that I'm sure Professor Bowling's going to point out. But again, this is the 1996 map. And that's the 2020 map. So Professor Bowling, can you talk a little bit about the changing electorate, and then why, what that means for Republicans when they're trying to figure out the right kind of candidate to run this year and in years forward?
Yeah, well, I think, Ali, those 2 questions, your question and Jonah's question, do tie in, pretty closely together. If you look at Virginia, it certainly is a much more moderate state politically, and I think philosophically today than it was a decade ago, particularly 2 decades ago, or in the 1990s, when Republicans really kind of, for the first time, seized power across all levels and branches of government in Virginia. So a lot of people look at that and they say, well, why doesn't the Republican Party try to moderate its positions and try to maybe adopt positions that appeal more to what I call this changing face of Virginia? And the answer to that is that you can't get elected until you get nominated. And in today's Republican Party, a candidate who is articulating more moderate positions is not going to win a nominations battle in the Republican Party, because the Republican Party is still controlled very heavily today by Tea Party type activists and by Trump type activists. And the last thing they want to hear is somebody talking about moderating the message of the party. So a candidate like a Glenn Youngkin has to try to track a little bit to the right in a nominating process in order to appeal to that base of the party if he wants to have any chance of becoming the party's nominee in a general election. But then he's also got to find a way to kind of tack back more to the center in a general election if he wants to have any chance to be able to reach out maybe to whatever true independent voters there might be out there in the state. So it is a challenge for a party like the Republican Party, not just in Virginia, but in many places across the country today, where you've got to be pretty far to the right in order to get nominated in today's Republican Party. But in places like Virginia, it's hard to get elected unless you find a way to tack more back to the center without alienating your political base. And that's about as complicated a formula as one can possibly, come up with. All of that challenge has taken place in Virginia over the last decade or two. That has changed dramatically. If you look at residential mobility patterns in Virginia over the last decade or two, the areas that have traditionally voted Republican, rural Virginia, are areas that are shrinking in population and impact. Areas that are heavily voting Democratic are areas that have grown by leaps and bounds, particularly in Northern Virginia. In the past 20 years, the population of Loudoun County has grown by 153%. In the past 20 years, the population of Prince William County has grown by 70%. And those folks are not these days voting Republican, they're voting Democratic. It's just a sheer matter of numbers. The last Republicans to win in Northern Virginia, I was proud to be a part of that ticket in 2009. I actually won Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and Prince William County. But the Republican voting strength since then has fallen off by 20 to 30 percentage points in these parts of the state that are just rapidly growing and changing. And then the other significant factor that has brought about this change, I think, in Virginia over the past decade or two, is the demographic patterns in Virginia have changed dramatically. The white population is declining. The Black population is growing moderately, but there has been an explosion in the population of Hispanic and Asian citizens and voters in Virginia, and they're voting 2-to-1 for Democratic candidates. So the Republican Party is in a tough spot in that the base of the party is still relatively where it was 10 or 20 years ago, but Virginia is in a very difficult place, a very different place. And that's made it very difficult for the Republican Party to be able to connect with this changing face of Virginia. So that's why I've always said, in order for a Republican these days to win one of these top of the ticket statewide campaigns, Republicans have to make good decisions. In this race, I think they have, in nominating a candidate who has run, I think, a very credible, effective, and good campaign. Democrats have to make some mistakes, and perhaps they have. And then the external environment has to be favorable, and perhaps it is. It's for a Republican to win one of these races in Virginia today, it has to be the perfect storm. This is the perfect storm. Now, what we will see on election day is even the perfect storm enough, to overcome this built-in advantage that Democrats have these days in Virginia. I think this will be a close race. I think the race could go either way. My gut tells me that it probably still favors the Democrats because of the sheer success that they've had over the past decade. But the stars are in alignment. If you're a Republican, I assure you, 2 weeks out, Republicans are more excited about their prospects of winning this election than they have been any time since 2009. And I think with justification. But again, the question is even the perfect storm enough? to overcome this built-in advantage that Democrats have in Virginia? We'll get the answer to that in a couple of weeks. If Republicans can't win this year with this candidate who's put $20 million of his own money into a campaign, then if Democrats still win, then the day after election, Republicans have to wake up and say, look, if a Ken Cuccinelli Republican and a Corey Stewart Republican can't win, if an Ed Gillespie Republican and a Glenn Youngkin Republican can't win, what kind of a Republican can win one of these races in Virginia today? So this is a very critical race for Republicans to see, have they figured out a formula that might work? So it's going to be fascinating to watch and see how those votes come in on election night.
Yeah, thanks. And one of the regions you touched on was Northern Virginia and how that changed from the red parts of the map to a blue part of the map pretty steadily. The other part of the map was down in southwestern Virginia that had been blue in 1996 and is now pretty steady red lately. And part of that can be explained by the urban-rural kind of divide that just defines a lot of polarization in American politics right now. But I didn't know if you had other thoughts on what was driving that, besides the fact that, you know, a lot of these other areas of the state might feel they've been ignored by the cities, economically a bit left behind, educationally a bit left behind, which then leads to, you know, scapegoats of immigration and racial groups, which Dr. Keenum pointed out might work with these more culture war dog whistle appeals. But I've not lived in that part of the state, nor do I really visit it. So so you ran there, and so tell me a little bit about what you think was going on there.
Well, not only did I run there, but that's where I was born and raised, was in the coal fields of Southwest Virginia and then the coal fields of Southern West Virginia. It is interesting that, 10 or 20 years ago, Southwest Virginia was solidly Democratic. The whole state of West Virginia was, of course, solidly Democratic. There has been this total realignment that has occurred in those parts of the state. Look, if you're a Republican, you feel good about something like that, right? You say, here's a part of the state that was Democratic, and now it's Republican. The problem is that's not where the people live. The problem is, you can get 80% of the vote in Buchanan County, Virginia, and you won't get as many votes as you get in one neighborhood in Fairfax County. What's the old story about the bank robber who was one time asked, why do you rob banks? And his answer was, that's where the money is. Well, if you're in politics, your ability to win elections, you have to be able to appeal to those areas where the people are. And the truth is that about 50% of Virginia's population today lives in about 6 or 8 key localities across the state. And unfortunately for Republicans, those are the very localities that are now voting more and more Democratic. At Fairfax County, Loudoun County, Prince William County. Look at the realignment that's occurred in Henrico County, which used to be a solidly Republican county, but it's now voting more and more Democratic. These are the areas that are growing. They're voting more and more Democratic. So Republicans have to figure out, how can we appeal to these suburban voters, the demographic changes, Hispanic voters, Asian voters. How can we get back some of these suburban women voters that we've lost and still be able to connect with this base of the party that is much farther to the right? It's a real challenge for Republicans in a place like Virginia and lots of other places. And in the past decade, in many ways, the Republican Party has gone farther and farther to the right, while Virginia has gone farther and farther to the left. And that is not a winnable combination. It's why the perfect storm has to be there for Republicans to be able to effectively compete in these top of the ticket statewide campaigns in our state today. Look, we're seeing these same changes in other states too. Look at what happened in Georgia in the 2020 presidential campaign and other places. So if you're a Republican leadership, you gotta figure that out. But it is the great challenge of being able to energize and mobilize the base of your party, which you have to be able to do to win, while at the same time being able to reach out and reconnect with these critical, more moderate and independent voters whose support you need, particularly in these growing suburban and urban areas of the state.
Thanks. And your answer right there actually made me think of something which, again, I don't hear as many ads as I suppose the average TV watcher or radio listener does. But one of the things that I thought would be maybe more in our faces would be the lingering effects of the Texas abortion ban. As a I don't think I count as young woman anymore, but moderately young woman, highly educated women, steady Democratic voter women. Abortion, I haven't heard that, you know, beyond the same way that Democrats have been pitching their pro-choice candidacy this election cycle. And you would think that if there was a way to make the stakes seem particularly important and relevant right now to that part of their base, that would have been a way to do it. And again, maybe I haven't been hearing those. And if they do exist, then I take it all back. But that hasn't really emerged as a talking point that I've been hit over the head with. And I kind of think that's a missed opportunity if you're talking about Democrats and how to generate some of this enthusiasm that in a past answer you said was kind of lacking. This next question is for Dr. Winterseek. We're going to talk about young voters. Also, this is a good time to mention that if you are in Richmond right now and you are not registered to vote in Richmond, you are going to need to request an absentee ballot. And the deadline for that is fast approaching. I think it's Saturday. It's 11 days out from the election. So if we count election day, that is Saturday. And I am assuming that is correct. Please go back and check. It would be a real shame if Barack Obama and Stacey Abrams were coming the day after the deadline. So I have to think they're smarter than that. But does anybody on the panel, can you guys confirm, is it Saturday?
It's not. It's Friday the 22nd by 5 p.m. And I only know that because I happen to have my syllabus up and I always put this in my syllabus. So
thank you. Let's talk about a major missed opportunity by Democrats then, who are having Terry McAuliffe do an event on the campus at VCU to try to get enthusiasm among young voters. But it's on Saturday, the day after registration. They're going to bring a former president and probably one of the most visible faces of the 2020 election, despite not running, Stacey Abrams. And they're going to come the day after the registration deadline for an absentee ballot. That is insane. And if they lose this race, they probably deserve it for that reason. Okay, Dr. Winterseek. According to early estimates, young voters, those under 30, so again, I don't count, are underperforming their turnout metrics in 2021 by worrying amounts. At this point in the 2020 election, roughly 10.7% of voters were under 30 versus only 5.2% today. That's less than halfway of where they should be based on last year's trends. Of course, there's always higher turnout in a presidential election year. But when we look at 2017, it's not much different. At this point in 2017, young voters represented 9.8% of the vote share that had been cast. So the 5.2% estimate today is just over halfway there. Do you have any insight on what's going on with younger voters this go round and what that could mean for the outcome of the election?
Sure. And I think I lied. I did have a thing I wanted to share, but that's okay. I sent it in the chat. So in the chat, what you will see is I've sent you a link. This is to Tufts University Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. They collect a whole bunch of really good data on youth voter turnout. And in this particular article I sent out, they have this nice heat map that shows young voter turnout. That's individuals 18 to 29 years of age. And in 2020, that is 56%, which puts us in about the top 10 in the country in terms of youth voter turnout. And so Dr. Reckendorf's very right. In 2020, we see the surge in young voter turnout, but perhaps the trends we're seeing here are a little bit more worrying. And so one of the things we need to think about are who are younger voters right now. Younger voters are Gen Z, so individuals born since 1996. That first group of young people comes of age during Donald Trump's administration. And then we have a small sliver of millennials, young millennials who are sort of tacked on to that, just under 30 age, but are still sort of in this young voter group. And what's quite interesting about these groups is that they're socialized in a particular era where they're coming in under Trump. They look to be on track to be a highly civically engaged generation. And so these are what we refer to as generational effects, right? We can't just say that young people don't vote and old people do vote, right? We have to look at what the generational trends are for particular groups of voters. And so what we are beginning to see is that Gen Z in particular is quite a group of participators. Millennials are also a group of participators. And they have indicated that they tend to be a bit more liberal, and they seem to be motivated by particular issues, specifically issues related to racial justice, climate change, and issues like gun control. And so as a group, these are highly motivating issues for these individuals. And they not only show up to vote around these issues, but they show up to protest around these issues, right? We see this in 2020. So in 2017, the last time we have a gubernatorial election here in Virginia, 69% of the 18 to 29-year-old group, and to be clear, at that time, that's mostly millennials at that point, voted for Northam. 30% voted for the Republican candidate in that election. What we should note is that this is a group that will turn out if they're engaged. And I think that we have seen efforts by both of the political parties to engage young voters with more or less success. So if you look at the last couple of weeks, you've seen a lot of political ads from both Youngkin and McAuliffe, specifically targeting young people, attempting to motivate them to show up to vote, especially because we're seeing low voter turnout. But what it seems is that that's been fairly ineffective, particularly on the Democratic side. Young Republican voters are likely a bit more motivated. They're a bit more of a homogenous group in terms of their interests and what they would like to engage in. And so Youngkin might do a little bit better as a whole than we might expect among that group. But McAuliffe is really struggling, and he's struggling because he is not coming to young voters with the issues they care most about. Issues like climate change, issues like racial justice, issues like gun control, and what he would do on those issues in the state of Virginia. And so this really comes back to an engagement gap, and that perhaps we aren't seeing that motivation to engage because the campaigns haven't done a very good job of putting young people's priorities at the top of their agendas.
And then as a follow-up, are there any other types of trends that you want to briefly mention that you think are going to influence this race? I know that Professor Bowling's touched on a couple of those, but anything else that you're seeing in the data?
That's a good question. I think just broadly this engagement gap question, right? In 2020, we have a lot of speculation about what the suburbs do. Ultimately, what the suburbs do are very important for Joe Biden's election and Donald Trump's defeat. We have a couple of really close races in 2020 for House that are based on those suburb votes. And so I think that we shouldn't assume just based on what happened in 2020 that the suburbs in Virginia are automatically blue. I think it's still a territory or areas that are still up for grabs. And so it will be interesting to see how that ultimately falls out. Other than that, those are sort of the things I've been tracking. Of course, I'm on VCU Votes Council, so I've been talking about the young people for the last many weeks, mostly.
And if you are on social media, if you're on Instagram, follow VCU Votes because they will tell you what's going on campus and with various deadlines. They would have known the deadline was Friday and not Saturday. So Stacey Abrams and Barack Obama should have checked out our VCU Votes Instagram too. All right, Professor Kerr, A
Yes,
common
ma'am.
refrain, especially among young voters, is that there's just no difference between the two parties. And quite honestly, that's a rather unsophisticated way to discuss party politics in the United States. Can you point to some issues that highlight the differences between the parties here in Virginia? Which issues are most salient right now in the governor's race? Maybe which issues have been salient in the past that are surprisingly not as salient right now? And in a race like the governor's race, how could the outcome of the election affect people's day-to-day lives?
Well, one point I want to make right away. We talked about how there's the abortion issue. What is it? Senate Resolution number 8 in Texas wasn't resonating in Virginia. The campaigns did not seem to be the ones picking up on that. I would submit that there has been a lot of activity on that issue, but mostly from groups not associated with the major political parties. There has been a lot of outreach, lots of mailings, lots of direct contacts to my students, phone calls, however they're contacted at home. This is an issue of importance to you. Virginia is going down the same road. You elect the House of Delegates, that's Republican. You elect a Republican governor, you could end up with an identical law to that in Texas. And that is a very important issue to young people, male and female. It resonates very heavily with the female young voters. And had that not become an issue, and it is a national issue, I don't think a lot of the younger people would have become, they seem to be taking an interest in this race. I pray they do register in time. So that, I think, is one of those issues that is very divisive or very telling for younger voters. I also think that there's a lot of anxiety placed, rightly placed and misplaced regarding police behavior, particularly when it comes to race. There's a lot of angst about the police and police training and police behavior. It's started with during the middle of the pandemic with George Floyd, and it never really quite stopped simmering. And I don't think either candidate has adequately addressed what they would do positively to improve that relationship. And race, definitely. The dog whistle stuff, and I would put, whenever people say CRT, I think of cathode ray tube as opposed to critical race theory, but that tells you how dated I am. That bothers a lot of people because, first of all, they can't define it, and secondly, they know what it really means. And so I think that's another issue that seems to be informed young voters get what it really means, and less informed older voters, well, they don't, and so they just kind of follow that dog whistle. So I think those are divisive, determining issues for young people. I'd say the abortion issue in particular, the aspect that outside groups are playing in this, not the parties, because the parties didn't seem to pick up on it. I think there's going to be determinant issues.
Thanks, David. I'm also going to put in the chat some more information about Virginia's deadlines, just to get the terminology right here. The absentee ballot request deadline is what's coming up on Friday. You can also early vote, and this link will tell you more about that. But if you have not registered to actually be a voter, you have missed the deadline to register to vote at this point. If you are registered to vote, you have lots of ways still at your disposal that don't involve driving back home to vote in person if you don't think you can do that. So check that out in the chat if you need those dates. All right. We haven't heard from Dr. Keena in a while, so I'm going to jump to Dr. Keena, and then we'll come back to Professor Bowling, and then we'll kind of wrap up with a more current events type question that I had to write at the last minute based on what was going on in the US Senate tonight. So Dr. Keena, let's talk gerrymandering. It's what you write your books about. In 2020, Virginia voters passed an amendment to create a bipartisan redistricting commission. Can you explain how that's supposed to work very briefly, and then talk about what is actually going on with the commission right now, how the parties are still influencing the process, and where that leaves us and our maps moving forward.
Well, the idea that, power sharing on a redistricting commission would lead to cooperation and would lead to an improvement of the process and drawing the maps in terms of fairness. I think a lot of people agreed with that sentiment. I supported the reforms, very vocal about that. It's important first to think about the reforms as being much bigger than just the commission. The reforms include a total redo of the entire process of drawing the maps. The commission has half the members are Republicans, half are Democrat, half are legislators, half are citizens. If they don't end up drawing maps, it goes to the Supreme Court of Virginia. And so either way, whatever, regardless of what's going on with the commission, the process is vastly improved over one party drawing the maps in secret and kind of cramming it down everyone else's throat. I mean, one of the consequences of transparency is that we get to see the dysfunction front and center. And one of the things that happened with the commission is that it broke down into camps. Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other side. They kind of had their own sort of parallel process, hiring their own experts. And it's more or less over with. They're not going to draw any maps. So I think this is an opportunity to talk about why we see these outcomes when we do, and how the redistricting process can be further improved. One of the dynamics that was at play when redistricting began was, for some reason, you had the commission deciding to scrap all three maps: the House, the State House, the State Senate, and the U.S. Congress maps completely and start over from scratch. In my experience, this is a terrible idea. This was an absolutely terrible idea, because now you have to, the potential for conflict is exponential. The other thing at play is that when you have citizens who are pretty much novices at the redistricting process sitting side by side with legislators who are experienced in redistricting, who are quite sophisticated, who know their own districts very well, this doesn't work very well. And there's a reason that the model that we adopted hasn't been adopted in any other state. It's because it's not very practical, and it doesn't lead to compromise. There's no incentive to compromise. And that may be part of the reason that the commission sort of broke down into camps. So I think what they need to do is they need to get rid of the legislators from the commission. They need to pass another constitutional amendment that creates a third group, which is unaffiliated voters. And when we see this model being adopted in other states, the commission almost always produces a plan that has overwhelming supermajority support. I think the truth is that a lot of the commissioners think that their side is going to get a better deal if it does go to the Supreme Court. So there's kind of an incentive not to work together. But despite all of that, in spite of all of the dysfunction, we have a much better process now than we did before. And if the Supreme Court of Virginia draws the maps, then they're probably going to be like a lot of other Supreme Courts, state Supreme Courts that end up drawing district maps. They're going to try to be impartial. They're going to try to be perceived as above the partisan fray. And they're probably going to not make a lot of dramatic changes from the existing lines. You won't see the Supreme Court of Virginia ripping up the current district maps that a court had actually drawn to redress vote dilution claims. They're going to stick with the current maps that we have and make slight adjustments to bring the maps into compliance with state and federal law.
Thanks. During that debate, one thing that always stuck out to me and that I was always very annoyed by was people would refer to it as a nonpartisan commission, and it's not right. It was bipartisan that left out those independent voters, that left out third parties. It very much actually entrenched the role of parties in the process, but that had been the standard status quo anyway. Just kind of actually put that, enshrined it in the Constitution.
That's right. Yeah, and enforced the two parties, gave them equal leverage, essentially, which was not the case during the last redistricting cycle.
Who, Professor Bowling, who has appointed most of the people on the Supreme Court of Virginia? Has it been Republican, Democrat, or kind of a mix? What do we know about that court, even though Dr. Kina says they're going to be very impartial?
Well, I think he's right. I think, the Supreme Court of Virginia has a reputation for being fairly impartial on matters of this nature. So, I don't know of the current members of the court. There's been such dramatic changes. My guess is that at this point in time, most of the members of that court have probably been appointed during times where Republicans still controlled a majority in the General Assembly, although that has changed of late. But look, these justices on the Supreme Court, I think Alex is right, are not going to draw maps based upon political party considerations. I think they take their job much more seriously than that. And in an ironic way, I was also a big advocate of bipartisan. I was more an advocate of truly nonpartisan redistricting and had proposed proposals to do that when I was a legislator and lieutenant governor. But you in order to get these changes made, you have to have a constitutional amendment, which has to be approved by the legislature. And legislators are not really very eager to give up power and on this or any other matter, and they perceive this as a matter of power. So we end up with this process, which is better, I agree, than what we had before because it's more transparent. But it probably was unworkable in its design, honestly. But at the end of the day, if there is an impasse, the default is that we have the Supreme Court to draw these districts. And at the end of the day, that may be the way that we get the best districts drawn, is to actually have them drawn by somebody other than a process controlled in whole or in part by the legislature. So it will be interesting to see what happens. I tend to agree if these maps go to the court, I suspect that we'll be looking at minor adjustments as opposed to major adjustments. But the one thing that I think the court will not do is be concerned about, well, which legislator lives in this district or which legislator lives in that district. And that was one of the factors that caused some of the early breakdown in this process that we saw before us. So what we have is certainly not a perfect process. It may not even be a workable process, but at the end of the day, because of transparency and this fallback of the court being able to draw districts, it may be better than what we had. I went through this process. I was involved in redistricting in 2000 and again in 2010. And I can tell you, other than judicial selection, it is probably one of the ugliest things that you will ever go through if you're a member of the legislature. There has to be a better way. I'm not sure we found it, but maybe we took a baby step in the right direction.
Great. Let's capitalize on having you here and having been on the last successful Republican statewide ticket in the state of Virginia. So
I refer to that as the good old days. But
in what ways has Youngkin's campaign mirrored or differed from other Republican campaigns around the country? We've kind of talked on that a bit. And then if he wins, what lessons do you think Republicans across the country would take away? Feel free to draw on your experience as a lieutenant governor of this state and having run campaigns yourself.
Well, I always felt in 2009, when Bob McDonnell was elected governor, I was elected lieutenant governor. We won those races amazingly by about 15 or 16 percentage points. It wasn't a close race. It was a landslide, which even at that time in Virginia was a shock and a surprise because we had come off of two consecutive Democratic governors, Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, at the time. I think the reason why our campaign was so successful, there were a couple of reasons. One, I think we ran a good campaign. We tried to focus on kitchen table issues that families care about. We talked about education and transportation and healthcare. Remember, that was prior to this hyper partisanship and rigid ideologies that soon came into the Republican Party through the Tea Party and the Trump movement. We had a lot more latitude in being able to talk about those kinds of issues in that campaign. And they were issues that resonated with suburban voters. That's why we won in places like Fairfax and Loudoun and Prince William counties. So it was a model campaign. I think Youngkin in some respects has tried to build upon that, although the challenges he is faced with a different base of the party today than we had in 2009 have been a little bit more difficult for him. The other reason that I think we were as successful as we were in 2009 is, with all due respect to our Democratic opponents, Democrats that year did not nominate a particularly strong candidate for governor. And I have great respect for Senator Creed Deeds. He's a friend of mine. He's someone that I admire in many ways, but he was from Bath County. He just didn't connect with he didn't energize the base of the Democratic Party. He didn't connect with a lot of the voters in these more urban and suburban centers. So it was the strength of the campaign we ran, combined with maybe the weakness of the campaign that our opponents ran. I think that is the similarity between 2009, perhaps, and 2021. I think Glenn Youngkin has run a good campaign. I think he's proven to be a good candidate. As to what, and on the other hand, the Democrats may have some challenges with this enthusiasm gap that we've been talking about. So the lesson in this, I think, for Republicans is, when you nominate reasonable candidates who run reasonable campaigns, you can at least be competitive in Virginia. And if your opponents happen to make a few mistakes along the way and the national wind is at your back, you still might be able to win in a place like Virginia. But one thing is for sure, if you nominate candidates that are so far to the right that they simply cannot connect with this changing face of Virginia, you don't have any chance of winning these campaigns. And Republicans certainly have experienced that. So maybe this is a model that Republicans can take. And if Youngkin does win this election, then Republicans will have to start looking for who it is in 2025 that maybe has that same political outsider brand. Having $500 million doesn't hurt. You know, if you can find that kind of a person, then maybe that's a model that Republicans can build on. But if Republicans fall back to the model that they used, for example, in 2013, it's just not going to work. So, what Republicans have to do to win in Virginia, to be competitive in Virginia, most of us who have been there and done that, we know what needs to be done. The problem is getting the base of the party to recognize what needs to be done and being willing to do it.
Awesome. And Gerardo, Professor Kina answered your question in the Q&A box, so go ahead and check that out. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the failed vote in the Senate that occurred late this afternoon, whereby Republicans in Congress blocked the passage of the Freedom to Vote bill. As most of you know, if you've taken Intro to American Government, passing any sort of legislation today essentially requires 60 votes because of the filibuster, which is why the filibuster has been talked about a lot in our national politics. On June 1st, hundreds of political scientists who are experts on the subject of elections and democracy signed a statement of concern aimed at the openly politically motivated attacks on voting rights taking place in state legislatures across the country. And unlike those states, Virginia has actually been adopting reforms that have made accessing the ballot easier while retaining election integrity since 2019. Because Dr. Kina was one of the signatories on that statement, I'm going to ask him to speak to this first. When we talk about state and local elections, like the governor's race, the attorney general's race, the House of Delegates, should we also be talking about how that outcome could shape the very nature and strength of democracy in the state? And then which post-2020 changes to election law more generally are most concerning to you, or which aspects of the now failed bill did you think would have been most vital to creating a strong democracy? So lots of questions in there. Dr. Kina, you can address whichever ones you want, and then we'll kind of go back down the row in reverse order that we started. And yeah, take it away.
Sure, I'm going to answer the latter half of that question first. Which part of these voting restriction laws being passed across the country disturbs me the most? And it's not necessarily taking in-person voting away or reducing the number of early voting dates. It's giving the legislature the power to basically overturn the results of democratic elections. This is what happened in Georgia, for instance, where the legislator there basically buried in the bill was a provision that if it's suspected that the results were somehow tainted or corrupted, the legislator could basically take control of the local board of elections and decide to reject certain results. That to me is deeply troubling, particularly when you think about balance of power issues that are built into these state constitutions. And it's not clear that they're actually constitutional on a state level. In terms of which features were in the Democrats' voting rights bill that would have been most important, well, there were provisions that restored some protections of the Voting Rights Act that were overturned by the Supreme Court last decade that would have gone a long way to give to provide a check against these laws in terms of their effects on racial and language minority groups. Do I think that the stakes of elections like the state level election that we have here in Virginia are really about the very nature of democracy? I think that we need to be skeptical about all political parties, not just the ones who are making vote suppression key tactic to their strategy of winning elections because the numbers aren't there. I think that, if we look back in even recent history, both parties want to try to manipulate the results so that their party can gain an advantage. And what the Republicans are doing is an extreme example of this that very much undermines some of the core values of our democracy. However, I think the best thing that we can do is just vote and make our voice heard and mobilize and not go away. And I think in that regard, every election is equally important in ensuring our democracy functions. Our democracy is not a thing that we're entitled to. It's something that we have to work towards, and all citizens need to play their role. And what that means is, at a minimum, just showing up on election day. And when the voters show up in droves, it changes the game. It changes the formula for the political parties. And yeah, the Republicans are really freaking slow at responding to these changes. But, the Republicans may be right. Eventually there'll be a scenario where the right conditions will come along and they'll retake power. And so I think that they don't want to sacrifice their core base because they think eventually they'll retake power and they'll get to take control of the General Assembly and pass whatever laws they want. So I think that in some ways, like, all elections are important. And the best thing that a citizen can do is, at a minimum, show up and vote so that that right is not taken away.
Thanks. And in Georgia, it was actually a Republican Secretary of State who they removed that power from and gave it to the legislature because he had not cooperated in the 2020 big lie as Trump's team had hoped. I think the other state is Arizona, but that person is a Democrat, so a little bit less surprising. But those are the two states where we've seen that happen. I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Winterseek here in a sec too. The one other thing I wanted to add was that in a 2015, I think it was, State of Center for American Progress Health of State Democracies report, Virginia was actually ranked number 50 out of 51 states, well, 50 states plus the district, in terms of being accessible, having representation in state government, and not having like corrupt influences on the political system. And a lot of the accessibility stuff would have changed since that report ran, since so many of election related laws have changed in the last few years. But when I moved here and saw that I was living in the only place below us is Alabama, because it's always Alabama. But we had 2 F grades and a D- on their report card. And so for me, I kind of think that the stake of going back to a less accessible ballot, although Dr. Kina is right that, like, historically, you can see politicians of both sides gaming things. The here and now, it wasn't that long ago that Virginia ranked 50 out of 51 on some of these measures. And so not unrealistic perhaps to think that some of those things that now are just so convenient would change back. But Dr. Winterseek, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that Dr. Kina ended on this sort of nice, bright note. I think I'm a bit more pessimistic in this group. I think we should be really cautious of this American story we tell ourselves about our great democracy and the infallibility of our democracy. The reality is that we have politics dominated by two political parties, and political parties are not democratic institutions. Some of you out there have probably taken my class and you're sick of hearing me say this, but at their heart, political parties are private interest groups. And as a private interest group, they really have three goals: to run candidates for elections, to win elections, and then to pass favorable public policy for their voters, right, for their base. And because of that, there is great incentive in our system to alter the rules of the game in a way that advantages your team. And we know from case studies all over the world that how democracies crumble is a death of 1,000 cuts. And it's through small incremental changes to institutions by political parties seeking to maintain their power. And while I have absolutely no doubt that the Democratic Party, if they were in the position that the Republican Party is in, would seek to limit access to the ballot box, the unfortunate reality is that at this time in this system, the Republican Party is responsible for overriding democratic norms, for seeking to undermine democratic values, and for effectively limiting the base understanding of what a good democracy is, and that is the right of the people to have a say in what goes on. And we know this, we know that the Republican Party and their strategies have said that the way they win is to limit voter turnout, right? There's this great phrase, Republicans should pray for rain. And that is because Republican vote shares, or more specifically, Democratic vote shares decline on days when there's incremental weather, when we have snow and rain. And so this is the same that it's applied to limiting the right to have access to the ballot box through a variety of means. But this isn't the only thing the Republican Party has done. In the last couple of years, they've also stacked the judiciary in their favor, right? So as we see these cases go up before the court, it becomes more and more likely that that court becomes more favorable to these Republican predispositions. And where then do we turn, right? If we're supposed to have a neutral judiciary that is supposed to adjudicate these issues, it leaves us in a rather weak democratic state. And while I wish that I could say that all you should do is go vote, I also completely recognize that we exist in a nation and in states that seek to intentionally limit the right to vote for certain people. And those people are young people, people of color, language minorities, as Dr. Kina has pointed out. And so I don't think that it's merely as simple as saying, go do your duty, go vote. While that is part of the solution, it is not the thing that will keep our democracy afloat. Because if we are committed to sinking the ship, if we're committed to maintaining power structures, I'm not sure that there's much that can be done to reverse that course.
Thank you, Dr. Winterseek. Professor Bowling, you want to take like 2 minutes to give us a quick last thought, and then Professor Kerr, we got another 2 minutes for you, and then unfortunately we're going to have to wrap this up and go eat dinner.
Yeah, I would just say, sticking with this theme that we've been on about the whole issue of election reform. There's an old saying that politics ain't beanbag, and that's true. And George Washington probably articulated better than anybody in history his disdain for political parties, his fear for the damage that political parties could do to the republic. Politicians will always act in their own self-interest. And look, I don't care if they're Republicans or Democrats, politicians will always act in their own self-interest and in the self-interest of their own political party. So when we get into these debates about election reform, there are certain things that Republicans are always going to see as a matter of protecting election integrity. And the same things will be viewed by Democrats as matters of voter suppression. That's nothing new. It's always been that way. And I suspect it will always be that way. It does leave a bad taste in the mouths of a lot of people. I'll just close with this thought. Our friend and colleague at the University of Virginia, Larry Sabato, has a great saying that he says politics is a good thing. And he has it on baseball caps and T-shirts and buttons and everything else, trying to say to people that politics done right can be a good thing. It can have a positive impact on society and people's lives. But unfortunately today, many people don't view politics that way, do they? They view it as a derivative word, poly meaning many and ticks meaning blood-sucking creatures. I mean, that's the way most people view politics today. And it's because of some of these ways that our political leaders conduct themselves. But it's true of Republicans, it's true of Democrats. I wish we had, more leaders. We started out talking about the hyper-partisanship and the polarization in government. I wish we had more leaders that would be John Kennedy's profiles in courage. Unfortunately, we just don't have many of them these days. But let's keep in mind that the people who serve there are people that are elected by we the people. So ultimately, it is our responsibility in determining the kind of folks we send to government and the views that they bring. And it ain't beanbag. It's never been beanbag. It's never been easy. Unfortunately, it is not easy today, and it probably never will be. One of the greatest challenges is balancing this idea of politics with policy and understanding that policy is always set in a political environment.
Yeah, and one of the things about, I don't know if it was the freedom to vote bill that just was blocked today. If it's one of the other two, Democrats have essentially 3 bills right now that kind of work in tandem. But on this question that Professor Bowling raises of expanding the vote, but also maintaining election integrity, preventing fraud, the bill, I'm pretty sure it's the one that just was blocked. It actually had reached a compromise to allow voter ID, which is usually that sticking point. Stacey Abrams gave it her blessing, which kind of annoyed some individuals on the far left who thought it was conceding too much. Because as Dr. Winterseek pointed out, that kind of voter fraud is not the kind of voter fraud that tends to actually impact races. But we saw a compromise enter, Congress's chamber that said, yeah, we'll agree to some degree of voter ID, not a strict voter ID, but we will agree to a nationalized plan of voter ID to preserve election integrity and allow it to not impact expansive access to the ballot. And even that doesn't end up getting passed, which doesn't leave me terribly optimistic for any sort of voting rights legislation in the future. Professor Kerr, take us away.
Yes, ma'am. It'll be quick too. First of all, in spite of the supposed leaning towards a compromise on the Senate bill that was rejected, I worked on the Senate side for 3 years, and I'll have to tell you, I am not at all surprised it was torpedoed and died. The Senate is not going to act on this. This is not 1965, and it just isn't going to happen anytime soon. It's just the nature of the body at the moment. It's way too polarized, has way too many people who are willing to filibuster it, and they don't have 60 votes, and they will not have 60 votes anytime soon. Also, we have passed some incredibly bad legislation, I think, in places like Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, to name a couple. There's some other states that are coming up with even better restrictions on voting. Texas makes it a crime to drive someone to the polls, and it makes it a crime to give them a glass of water if they want one while they're waiting in the line at the polls. That is incredible, and yet there it is. Now, the consequence of this, people will stay away from voting. They get, particularly African Americans. They have a long history, a long memory. In this state, I went to school in segregated schools. I remember when we did not have the Voting Rights Act, very vaguely, and it was very difficult to register to vote. You had to go to the registrar's office to do it, and it wasn't always open. It seemed to be closed a lot for Black people. I think it's going to push them back away from the polls if we don't, not in Virginia so much, but nationally. There's an angst and a fear of going to vote sometimes if you're African American. For instance, at one time, for identity purposes, your utility bill was an acceptable identity. Now it's not. So after a while, there's this, well, it's all rigged against me. I'll just stay home. There's a lot.
We lost David, but we will end there. I will leave you filling in the blanks of the rest of his sentence and just say thank you to those of you who stuck with us the full 2 hours. Thank you to former Lieutenant Governor and POLI Professor Bill Bowling, who will be teaching parties and elections in the spring. Thank you to Dr. Amanda Winterseek, who teaches a bunch of good stuff. And I think it's what, media and public opinion, media and
I think it's media and politics. We broke
Media
up that
and
giant
politics.
class. Yeah.
in the spring, and Dr. Alex Kina, who is going to be teaching new special topics course. Talk to your advisors. They will put it in your concentration. That's going to be on money, gerrymandering, and election. All right.
Thank you, Allie, for moderating. And
Yes,
take care,
thank you.
It
everyone.
was fun. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.